In a small, divided neighborhood, one man's heroism shatters the barriers of prejudice and fear. When a black veteran hears a woman scream, he risks everything to save her. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. James Jimmy Carter had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. His home was a modest but well-kept single-story house, painted in soft beige with a small porch where he often sat in the evenings, sipping his coffee. Out back, he had a vegetable garden, neatly arranged with tomatoes, peppers, and collard greens. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, he would be out there, tending to the plants with a careful hand. It was a quiet life, one of routine and reflection, but it wasn't without its difficulties. At 68, Jimmy carried himself with the disciplined posture of a man who had served his country. His movements were steady, deliberate, his deep brown eyes sharp yet kind. He had been through wars, had seen men at their best and worst, and had long learned that true battles weren't always fought on the battlefield. Sometimes, they were fought in everyday moments, in a glance held too long, in a door that wasn't held open, in whispers that were just loud enough to be heard. Despite this, Jimmy never let the unspoken tensions of the neighborhood break his spirit. He was always polite, always willing to lend a helping hand. If someone's car wouldn't start, he was there with jumper cables. If a storm knocked a tree branch down, he'd be the first to grab a saw and clear it away. Some neighbors appreciated him for it. Others, like Mark Henderson, tolerated him at best. Mark had lived in the neighborhood the longest, a broad-shouldered man with thinning gray hair. He was the kind of person who always seemed to be watching, judging. To him, Jimmy was an outsider, even after all these years. He never openly confronted him. No, Mark wasn't the type to do that. Instead, he would make offhand remarks to other neighbors, plant doubts, spread quiet mistrust. "I don't have a problem with him," he'd say, "but you never really know people, do you?" And that was enough. Lisa Turner had moved in 5 years ago, a single mother with a young son, Ethan. She worked long shifts as a nurse, always exhausted but pushing through. At first, she had been wary of Jimmy, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the neighborhood had a way of shaping people's perceptions. She had heard things, sensed the division. So, she had kept her distance, exchanging polite nods and nothing more. Ethan, on the other hand, was fascinated by Jimmy. The boy would often watch him from their porch, curious but too shy to approach. Jimmy had noticed and had once waved, but Lisa had gently pulled Ethan inside. It wasn't hostility, just hesitation. Hesitation born from years of learning to be cautious. For the most part, Jimmy kept to himself. He had learned long ago that being too friendly in places like this could sometimes backfire. Still, he refused to let it make him bitter. He had seen worse. He had endured worse. And despite everything, he still believed in kindness. But kindness alone wasn't always enough to keep trouble at bay. A quiet evening had settled over the neighborhood, the usual stillness wrapping the houses in a sense of routine calm. Lisa had just put Ethan to bed, exhausted from another long shift at the hospital. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, trying to shake off the fatigue. The weight of single motherhood pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she had grown used to carrying it. Then came a noise, a faint rustling outside. At first, she dismissed it, just the wind, maybe a stray cat. But then, the sound of a door handle jiggling. Her heart stopped. She stood slowly, every nerve in her body tightening. Before she could react, the back door burst open. 3 masked men flooded in, moving with a precision that sent a bolt of fear through Lisa. This wasn't a random break-in. They knew what they were doing. Lisa barely had time to scream before one of them lunged, grabbing her wrist and shoving her against the counter. Ethan, awakened by the commotion, ran to the top of the stairs, eyes wide with terror. "Stay quiet," the leader hissed, his gloved hand tightening on her arm. "Do what we say, and no one gets hurt." Across the street, Jimmy had been finishing up at his garden, winding down for the night, when he heard Lisa's scream. It was the kind of sound that cut through the air, sharp and desperate. His body reacted before his mind fully processed it. Years of military training surged through him, instincts honed from battle taking over. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from his porch, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward Lisa's house. Through the window, he saw them. 3 men, their faces covered, one of them gripping Lisa's arm while Ethan stood frozen on the stairs. The boy's face was pale, his small hands gripping the railing in sheer terror. Jimmy's fist clenched. He had seen fear like that before, in places far worse than this quiet suburban street. He had spent years protecting people, fighting for what was right. But here, in this neighborhood, he wasn't seen as a protector. He was seen as an outsider, and someone was already watching. From his own house, Mark Henderson had heard the commotion. He stepped onto his porch, squinting toward Lisa's home. His gaze landed on Jimmy, standing tense near the window. And just like that, his mind made up a story, one that fit his long-held suspicions. He turned back inside and grabbed the phone. "There's a break-in," he told the dispatcher. "Yeah, I see the guy." Black male, about late 60s. "Looks dangerous. You better send someone fast." Back at Lisa's house, Jimmy stood at the threshold, his mind racing. He knew what would happen if the police arrived and saw him inside a white woman's home, standing over an injured intruder or restraining a man. He had seen it play out too many times. If he acted, he risked everything. If he hesitated, Lisa and Ethan might suffer. The decision had to be made now. Jimmy took a slow, measured breath, his mind sharpening as it had in the past when danger loomed. He studied the intruders with the precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. 3 men, one holding Lisa, another near the stairs, the last one rummaging through drawers. But something was off. These weren't hardened professionals. The one gripping Lisa's arm had too tight a hold, almost as if he was afraid she'd fight back. The second man, the one searching the house, moved with jittery hands, knocking over a lamp by mistake and cursing under his breath. The third, standing by the back door, shifted his weight nervously, his fingers twitching over the handle of his gun. That was the leader, the one calling the shots. But even he wasn't fully in control. Jimmy had faced real threats before. These men were dangerous, yes, but they weren't prepared for resistance. If he could create a moment of chaos, just a few seconds, it might be enough to pull Lisa and Ethan out of harm's way. He glanced down and saw a loose brick near the flower bed. Silently, he picked it up, feeling the rough edges in his palm. With careful aim, he threw it toward the side window of the house. The glass shattered with a loud crash. The reaction was immediate. "What the hell was that?" the leader snapped, spinning toward the noise. Lisa seized the moment. She twisted in the intruder's grip, wrenching herself free. Jimmy was already moving. He darted inside and grabbed Ethan, pulling him down from the stairs and pushing him toward the back door. "Go!" Jimmy urged Lisa, shielding them both with his body. But they weren't fast enough. The jittery burglar, recovering from the distraction, turned back and saw them. His eyes widened in surprise before narrowing in anger. He pulled a gun from his waistband, raising it in one shaky hand. "Stop right there," he warned, his voice cracking. Jimmy tensed, shifting his body in front of Lisa and Ethan. His instincts screamed at him to act, to disarm, to neutralize the threat. He could see the hesitation in the man's stance, the way his grip trembled. The man wasn't ready to shoot. Not yet. But then red and blue lights flooded the room. Sirens blared outside. Tires screeched to a stop. Before anyone could react, the front door burst open and uniformed officers stormed in. Their weapons were drawn, but their focus wasn't on the burglars. It was on Jimmy. "Hands in the air," one of them barked. Jimmy barely had time to process it before multiple guns were aimed directly at him. His heart pounded as he slowly raised his hands. Fingers spread. Lisa's voice cut through the chaos. "No, he's helping us. Those men. Get down. Now!" An officer shouted, drowning her out. The burglars didn't waste a second. In the confusion, they bolted. One knocked over a chair. Another slipped through the shattered window, disappearing into the night. Jimmy remained still, breathing hard, the weight of a dozen assumptions pressing down on him. Lisa lunged forward, but an officer blocked her, keeping his attention locked on Jimmy. Ethan clutched his mother's arm, his eyes filled with terror. And Jimmy, a man who had spent his life protecting others, found himself staring down the barrels of guns meant for criminals. The part ends with tension thick in the air, Jimmy frozen, Lisa screaming, and the real criminals vanishing into the darkness. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Jimmy's wrists as the officers forced his arms behind his back. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the yard, illuminating Lisa's panicked face. "He was helping us," Lisa screamed, struggling against an officer who held her back. "You're arresting the wrong man." Ethan clung to her, his small body trembling, his tear-streaked face pressed into her side. The officers, however, weren't listening. They had arrived with a call about a dangerous intruder, and Jimmy fit the description they had in their minds. The real criminals had slipped away into the night, but none of that mattered now. "Sir, remain silent and cooperate," one officer said firmly, gripping Jimmy's arm. Jimmy didn't resist. He knew better. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. Any sudden movement, any protest, could turn the situation deadly. He had seen it happen before. Mark Henderson stood across the street, arms crossed, watching with smug satisfaction. He had done what he thought was right. In his eyes, this was justice. He didn't need to see what had really happened. He already believed he knew the truth. As the officers led Jimmy toward the squad car, Lisa made one last desperate attempt. "Check the cameras. My security cameras, there's footage. He saved us. My son saw everything." One officer hesitated, exchanging a glance with his partner. But before either of them could respond, Mark interjected from his front yard. "Security cameras," he scoffed. "You really think a man like that doesn't know how to cover his tracks?" Lisa whipped around, fury blazing in her eyes. "You saw what happened, Mark. You know he didn't." "All I know," Mark interrupted, "is I saw him outside your house, and now look at this mess." Maybe he got scared when the cops showed up and tried to play the hero. You don't know what he was up to before that. Lisa clenched her fists, but before she could say anything else, the squad car doors slammed shut, sealing Jimmy inside. At the police station, the air was thick with unspoken judgments. Jimmy sat across from a detective, his wrist now free, but still marked red from the cuffs. The questioning was relentless. "You say you acted on instinct," the detective said, leaning forward, "that you were just trying to help. But let's talk about your military background. Special training, combat experience. You're a man who knows how to fight." Jimmy's jaw tightened. He had heard this tone before. The carefully disguised suspicion, the subtle shift from asking about his service to implying it made him dangerous. "So tell me, Mr. Carter," the detective continued, "did you see an opportunity? Maybe things got out of control." Jimmy exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "The only thing that got out of control was how fast you assumed I was the threat." Meanwhile, Lisa wasn't giving up. She gathered everything she could, her home security footage, Ethan's terrified testimony, even statements from the few neighbors who had seen glimpses of the chaos. She demanded that the police review the evidence, but the damage had already been done. The narrative was set. Jimmy had been seen at the scene, a man with combat experience, a lone black veteran in a predominantly white neighborhood, arrested under suspicion while the real criminals walked free. And Mark made sure to fuel that perception. Within hours, whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into full-blown speculation. I heard he attacked one of them before the cops showed up, Mark said to a small gathering of neighbors. That's why they ran. He lost control. He always did seem a little too intense, another neighbor murmured. Maybe he's got PTSD or something, someone else added. He should have just waited for the police. The truth no longer mattered. A different story had taken its place. Detective Sarah Evans sat in her small office, the pile of paperwork in front of her barely touched. The case had become a tangled mess of assumptions, accusations, and conflicting stories. She had seen it all before, but something about this one gnawed at her. The more she reviewed the evidence, the more she began to see cracks in the narrative. Mark Henderson's statement, for one, didn't match up with the timeline of events. Mark claimed to have seen Jimmy acting suspiciously outside Lisa's house, but when Evans checked the security footage, there was no indication that Jimmy had been anything but helpful. The inconsistencies were there, too obvious to ignore. Evans was no stranger to bias, but she had always prided herself on being fair, on seeing things from every angle. She had worked too many cases where the wrong person had been accused simply because it was easier to believe the story already told. This time, something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Ethan's voice was a quiet but steadfast beacon in the storm of chaos surrounding them. The young boy had become Jimmy's unexpected ally. Though still shaken by the traumatic events, Ethan refused to stay silent. He saved us, Ethan insisted, his small voice quivering but full of conviction. He didn't hurt anyone. He just helped us. He tried to keep us safe. Lisa watched her son with pride, even as her own frustration grew. The town was divided, and she knew she was fighting an uphill battle. But seeing Ethan stand up, his young eyes filled with an unwavering trust in Jimmy, gave her a renewed sense of determination. If her son could speak the truth, then so could she. Lisa found herself increasingly unwilling to accept the bias that had shaped her life in this neighborhood. She had spent years remaining neutral, keeping her head down, trying to avoid conflict. But watching her neighbor, her friend, be vilified, while the real criminal slipped away without consequence, pushed her to take a stand. She began to speak out. At first, it was subtle, small conversations with a few neighbors, asking them to consider what had really happened. But as the days passed, her resolve hardened. She started attending community meetings, challenging the narrative being spun by Mark and others. "We can't just go along with what we're told," she said one evening, her voice rising above the murmurs of doubt. "We've seen the footage. We've heard the truth. Jimmy didn't do anything wrong." Some neighbors hesitated. They had known Mark for years. They trusted him. But Lisa's words began to sink in, and the seed of doubt was planted. Perhaps they had been too quick to judge. Meanwhile, Jimmy's mind wandered through the past. The quiet calm of his cell couldn't fully drown out the memories that haunted him. The voices, the insults, the side glances, the prejudice that had followed him everywhere. Even during his time in the military, he remembered his first tour, the looks from some of his fellow soldiers, the whispers behind his back, the way they treated him differently because of his skin color. He had learned to swallow his anger, to keep his head down, to follow orders without question. But there were moments that stayed with him, moments when he had spoken out against injustice, only to be met with the cold sting of dismissal or the sharp edges of a commanding officer's words. "You don't belong here," they had said, though they never put it quite so plainly. It had been a different kind of war, one fought not with weapons, but with subtle, corrosive cruelty. Now, here he was again, fighting a battle that felt all too familiar, one where his background, his race, and his identity were being used against him. Even as he sat in that cold interrogation room, his body stiff in the handcuffs, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time he had been wrongly accused. But despite the weight of the past, Jimmy remained calm. He had fought for his country, and now he had to fight for his name. He would endure this, just as he had endured before. Days later, after the security footage was reviewed, the truth became clear. Jimmy had acted in self-defense, trying to protect Lisa and Ethan from the burglars. The police released him, But the damage had already been done. The story was out there. Even though the evidence had cleared his name, the stain of suspicion remained. People talked. Whispers of the dangerous veteran persisted, and Jimmy's reputation, once solid, was now fractured beyond repair. Lisa stood by him, though. She was his unwavering ally. And as the neighborhood slowly began to reassess its views, there was one thing that remained certain. No matter what the world believed, Jimmy was a hero. Jimmy returned home later that evening, the familiar sight of his house bringing little comfort. The events of the past few days still felt like a haze, a blur of confusion, accusations, and half-formed truths. But nothing prepared him for what he saw when he pulled into his driveway. His garage door was defaced, spray-painted in large, angry letters. Slurs, insults, and hateful words stared back at him. The words felt like a personal assault, an attack not just on his character, but on his very existence. The weight of the damage, the ugliness of the message, sank deep into his chest. The neighbors had either turned their backs or remained silent. No one had stepped forward to clean the graffiti. No one had called to apologize. The community he had once quietly tolerated now felt foreign, hostile, and cold. The divide was evident. Some of the neighbors, those who had whispered behind his back, continued to view him with suspicion. Others, like Lisa, had started to rally in his defense. But it was clear this was more than just an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of prejudice, a simmering resentment that had found its target. Lisa was still determined to uncover the truth. The more she dug, the more she realized that there was more to the situation than met the eye. She spent days sifting through the sparse information she could find, piecing together fragments of conversations and odd connections that hadn't made sense before. And then one afternoon, it hit her like a wave. One of the burglars, one of the masked men who had broken into her house, was Mark's nephew. Lisa's heart raced as she pieced together the timeline and the connections. Mark's nephew had a criminal record, one that he had tried to keep hidden from the rest of the community. Lisa had never made the connection before, but now it was clear. Mark had lied about everything. He had tried to shift the blame onto Jimmy, not just to save face, but to protect his own family. With the discovery in hand, Lisa marched over to Mark's house, determination in her stride. She knocked on the door, and Mark answered, his face immediately clouding over when he saw her. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I know what you did," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside. "I know about your nephew." Mark's eyes flickered for a moment, and in that split second, Lisa saw something. Guilt, fear. He stepped back, his hands instinctively tightening into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mark growled, his voice low and threatening. "I know he was one of the burglars," Lisa said, pressing him. "And I know you've been covering for him." Mark's face turned red. He slammed the door in her face before she could say anything else. But Lisa didn't back down. She immediately reached out to Detective Sarah Evans, who, despite her skepticism at first, had started to look at the case with new eyes. "I've found something," Lisa told her, her voice urgent. "One of the burglars is Mark's nephew. I think he's been lying to protect him." Evans was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the information. Finally, she spoke. "Give me everything you've got. I'll look into it." It didn't take long before Detective Evans quietly reopened the case. She reviewed new evidence, including Lisa's findings, and began to investigate Mark's connection to the burglary. There were too many signs pointing to the truth now, too many inconsistencies in Mark's story. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. As the investigation shifted and the truth began to unfurl, Jimmy sat quietly in his home, the weight of it all settling into his bones. The vandalism on his garage was a constant reminder of the hatred and ignorance he had faced his entire life. But there was something else, a fire that refused to die. He had been wronged. He had been judged unfairly. But he wasn't going to let this be the end. Exhausted but resolute, Jimmy decided it was time to take a stand. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, who had faced prejudice and hate without reason. He wasn't going to let the lies continue, not this time. He would face the truth, no matter the cost, and he would make sure the world saw him for who he really was, a man of honor, of integrity, and of justice. The major twist had come, but the battle was far from over. The story of the black veteran who had risked his life to save others was far from finished. It was only just beginning. Detective Evans had always been cautious in her approach, especially when dealing with sensitive matters involving personal biases. But the more she followed the trail, the clearer it became. Mark's nephew, the one she had initially dismissed as a mere bystander in the case, was heavily involved in the burglary. She had uncovered enough evidence to tie him directly to the crime, but Evans needed something more, something that would make it undeniable. It was a painstaking process, following every lead, reviewing every piece of evidence, and quietly gathering testimonies from those who knew Mark. The puzzle pieces began to fit together, revealing a pattern of lies and cover-ups. Mark had been so intent on protecting his family, he had allowed his biases to blind him to the truth. But now, as the investigation began to unfold, the truth was undeniable. Meanwhile, Lisa's resolve only grew stronger. She refused to let the community's prejudice continue to tarnish Jimmy's name. One by one, she approached the neighbors who had initially been wary of Jimmy, telling them the full story of what had happened that night. The support slowly but steadily began to grow. It wasn't just the adults who were beginning to question their assumptions. Ethan, who had been so terrified in the wake of the break-in, found his courage. He had spent days replaying the events in his mind, and he knew the truth. Jimmy had saved them. He couldn't stand to see the injustice any longer. One morning, Ethan stood in front of his entire class at school, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his hand, and the teacher called on him. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "The man who saved my mom and me wasn't a criminal. His name is Jimmy Carter. He's a hero. The real bad guys were the ones who broke into our house. And I'm not going to let anyone say he did anything wrong." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Some of the children knew who Jimmy was. They had seen him around the neighborhood, helping others with small tasks, planting in his garden or fixing things. But hearing it from Ethan, hearing it from the child who had been saved, made everything clear. The ripple effect spread. Ethan's classmates began telling their parents, who in turn started talking to their neighbors. The tide was slowly beginning to turn. But Mark, realizing his hold on the narrative was slipping, grew more aggressive. He wasn't used to losing control, especially when it came to protecting his reputation. He saw the support building for Jimmy and the mounting evidence against his nephew, and he panicked. One evening, Mark cornered Lisa outside her house, his face tight with frustration and anger. "You need to stay out of this, Lisa," he spat, his voice low but threatening. "You have no idea what you're messing with. You're going to regret this." Lisa stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You can't keep lying. People are starting to see the truth. You won't get away with this." Mark's eyes flickered with something dark. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If you keep pushing, I'll make sure you regret it." But Lisa wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. Later that week, Jimmy finally made the decision he had been putting off for so long. It was time to confront Mark face to face. He didn't need to raise his voice or throw insults. He simply needed to speak the truth. Jimmy approached Mark's house one evening, his gait steady and purposeful. When Mark saw him approaching, his expression hardened, but he didn't try to back away. "Jimmy, what do you want?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "I want to talk," Jimmy replied calmly. "I don't want any more fighting. Just the truth." Mark scoffed. "Truth? What's that supposed to mean? Do you remember the time we were both stationed overseas?" Jimmy asked, his voice low. "You and me in the desert during that mission. We both saw things that were wrong, things we didn't speak up about. You remember, don't you?" Mark's face twitched, a flicker of something beneath his hardened exterior. The past had a way of resurfacing, and Jimmy knew just the words to make it do so. "You're not the man you pretend to be, Mark," Jimmy continued. "You've been hiding behind your lies for too long. We both know what it feels like to be wrongfully judged. You don't want to let that happen to me, do you?" For a long moment, Mark stood silent, his eyes avoiding Jimmy's. The tension in the air was thick, like something was about to snap. Mark finally took a breath, his voice quieter, almost strained. "You think you know me? You think you know what I've been through? I know what it's like to be wronged," Jimmy said, his tone steady. "I know how hard it is to face prejudice, but I also know how to stand up for what's right." Mark didn't respond immediately. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the anger in his eyes shifting to something else. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. Jimmy could see the cracks beginning to show. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unsaid words. Mark wasn't ready to admit his mistakes, not yet. But for the first time, it seemed like he was listening, like the hardened walls around him were starting to erode. Jimmy had done what he needed to do. He had spoken the truth, and in doing so, he had begun to crack open the darkness that had been holding Mark in its grip. The twist had come. The truth had been set in motion. And now, there was no turning back. Instead of allowing his anger to dictate his next steps, Jimmy took a deep breath and chose a path that was true to who he was, one of strength, dignity, and purpose. He had been wronged, yes, but revenge wasn't what he needed. Justice wasn't always about confronting others in anger. It was about speaking the truth and letting that truth shape the future. The town hall meeting had been scheduled for weeks, a regular forum where the community could discuss issues, voice concerns, and make decisions about local matters. But this time, the stakes were higher. Jimmy had been invited to speak, something that felt almost surreal. After all the pain, the accusations, and the whispers, here was his chance to finally address the people who had judged him. As he entered the community center, Jimmy could feel the weight of the room. The eyes of familiar faces, some filled with judgment, others with curiosity. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would receive, but he had made his decision. He was going to speak his truth, and he wasn't going to hold back. When it was his turn to address the room, Jimmy stood tall at the podium. His heart beat steadily in his chest as he looked out over the crowd. The hum of whispers quieted as he began. "I'm here today not to seek revenge," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here to speak the truth. I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I've kept to myself, quietly helping where I can, hoping to be part of something larger, a community that values fairness and justice. But recently, I've learned what it's like to be judged by the color of my skin, to be misunderstood and condemned without reason." There was a murmur in the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably, while others seemed to lean in, listening more intently. Jimmy continued, not letting the doubt in their eyes stop him. "I'm not a criminal. I never was. I served my country with pride and honor, and I did what was right that night when I helped Lisa and Ethan. But despite that, some of you believed the worst about me. Some of you listened to lies instead of looking at the truth." He paused, allowing his words to settle. The silence was heavy now, but there was no turning back. He had their attention. "I know what it feels like to be labeled for no reason other than the color of your skin. I know what it's like to face prejudice and hatred without knowing why. But that's not who we should be as a community. We should stand together, not tear each other apart." Jimmy's voice grew stronger as he spoke, not from anger, but from a deep sense of conviction. "We have a choice. We can continue down this path of division and distrust, or we can choose redemption. We can choose understanding, unity, and growth. It starts with us, each of us looking beyond our biases, each of us reaching out to the person next to us, no matter their background. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for respect, for truth, and for change." The room was still. Jimmy's words seemed to resonate, echoing through the hearts of many who had initially doubted him. He could see the shift, the subtle nods of agreement, the softening expressions. This wasn't about pointing fingers or blaming. It was about calling for a higher standard, for something better than what had been. By the time he finished, there was no applause, no immediate cheers. But the impact was clear. He had given them something to think about, something to feel. The room wasn't the same as it had been when he first walked in. The seeds of change had been planted. As Jimmy left the podium, a quiet murmur spread among the crowd. People were talking about the speech, about the truth he had shared, and about their own biases. He had done what he set out to do. He had spoken out, and it had made a difference. The next day, Detective Sarah Evans, now armed with undeniable evidence, took a major step forward. After weeks of painstaking investigation, she had enough to make an arrest. Mark's nephew had been involved in the break-in, and Mark's attempts to cover it up were now clear. Evans arrived at Mark's home early in the morning, her demeanor professional but firm. Mark's face went pale when he saw her at the door. "Mark Henderson, I'm arresting you for obstruction of justice and aiding and abetting a criminal," Evans announced, her voice calm but unwavering. Mark's initial shock gave way to anger, but he knew it was over. The truth was out. His nephew was in custody, and his efforts to protect him were falling apart. As Evans led Mark away, the community's eyes shifted from suspicion and doubt to something else. Understanding, perhaps, and the realization that the wrong person had been targeted all along. Jimmy, too, had a moment of reflection. He had done what he needed to do, not through violence or anger, but through truth and conviction. He had found a way to bring justice without revenge. The road ahead wasn't easy, but Jimmy knew that his voice had made a difference. The community had heard him. The tide was shifting. Now, it was time to continue the fight. Not just for his own redemption, but for the redemption of a community that had so long been divided by fear and prejudice. The next chapter of their story was just beginning, and Jimmy was ready to face it with strength, courage, and the truth. Mark stood silently as the police led him away, his body rigid with humiliation. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who called the shots, the one who dictated how things would unfold in his corner of the world. But now, with his nephew in custody and his own involvement exposed, Mark was no longer in control of the narrative. The truth had shattered everything he had worked to protect. As the days passed, something shifted in Mark. He couldn't shake the image of the community's reaction, the way his neighbors looked at him differently, the quiet whispers behind closed doors. The walls he had spent years building to shield his pride and protect his reputation were crumbling around him. No longer could he hide behind his rigid prejudices or his false narratives. The truth was out, and with it came the realization that he had been wrong, not just about Jimmy, but about everything he had ever assumed about people different from himself. He didn't fully apologize. His pride was too deep, too ingrained. But Mark knew it was time to stop resisting the truth. He couldn't keep denying what had happened, not anymore. The lies he had told himself for so long had led him down a dark path. And now, all he had left was the bitter taste of regret. The tension in the community was palpable. People were beginning to question the way they had viewed Jimmy, to reconsider their assumptions and biases. The town had always been divided, but now, slowly, it was coming together in ways no one expected. Neighbors who had once avoided Jimmy now stopped to greet him with friendly smiles. Some even nodded in silent acknowledgement, recognizing the injustice they had allowed to persist for so long. It wasn't a perfect shift, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope that the community could find healing and redemption. And at the heart of it all was Jimmy, steady and unyielding, his resolve unbroken by the trials he had faced. He didn't seek validation or praise. He had done what was right, and that was enough for him. But as he walked down the street, he couldn't help but notice the change in the air. People were no longer crossing the street to avoid him. They were looking him in the eye, meeting his gaze with respect and acknowledgement. Then came the moment that cemented the truth of what had happened. It wasn't in the headlines or the news reports. It wasn't even in the courtroom. It came in a simple act of gratitude from two people who had seen firsthand the kind of man Jimmy was. One afternoon, Lisa and Ethan stood at the front of the community center. The crowd gathered in a tense but expectant silence. The words Lisa had been holding back for so long finally found their way to the surface. She had always known that Jimmy was a hero. She had seen it in the way he acted that night, in the way he had risked everything to protect her and Ethan. But now, she had the chance to say it aloud, to affirm what everyone in the room already knew. Everyone, Lisa began, her voice calm but firm. I want to say thank you. I want to thank Jimmy for what he did that night, for saving Ethan and me. But it's more than just that. He didn't have to do what he did. He didn't have to risk his own safety for us. But he did. And I think we all need to remember that. She paused, her eyes scanning the room, making sure her words were sinking in. Jimmy is a hero. He didn't just save us from that break-in. He saved us from ourselves, from the prejudices and biases that we've been living with, the ones that have clouded our judgment and made us blind to the truth. Ethan, standing beside her, looked up at Jimmy with admiration in his young eyes. Thank you, Jimmy, he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. You saved us, and I'll never forget that. The room was still for a moment. Then, slowly, people began to clap. At first, it was hesitant, uncertain. But as more people joined in, the applause grew louder, stronger, more genuine. There was no longer any doubt in anyone's mind. Jimmy was not the villain of this story. He was the hero, and the community was beginning to see it. Mark, standing at the back of the room, felt the weight of their gaze. The applause wasn't for him, nor would it ever be. The truth had come to light, and there was no escaping it. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could no longer ignore the fact that he had been wrong. The redemption that Jimmy had sought for so long wasn't just for Jimmy. It was for everyone, and Mark knew deep down that he would have to face that truth every day for the rest of his life. As the applause finally died down, Jimmy stood quietly, absorbing the moment. He didn't need accolades or applause. He didn't need to be celebrated. What mattered was the shift he had helped create. What mattered was that the community had come together, had found a way to move beyond the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. And for the first time in a long while, Jimmy felt a sense of peace. The struggle had been long, and it had taken everything he had to get to this point. But he knew it had been worth it. He had stood up for what was right, not just for himself, but for a community that was finally learning to see the truth. In the end, justice wasn't just about the law. It was about the hearts and minds of the people who chose to make the world a better place. And that was the greatest victory of all. The days following the town hall were quiet, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Mark, once the figurehead of division, found himself grappling with a new, uncomfortable reality. He had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to control situations, to dictate what happened next. But now, with the truth laid bare, that control was slipping through his fingers. Mark didn't speak openly about it, but there were small signs. A pause in his conversations with his neighbors, a softer edge to his usual gruffness. When he passed Jimmy on the street, he no longer turned his head away or muttered under his breath. Instead, Mark nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. A quiet acknowledgement that things had changed, that he had changed. The walls he had spent years building were slowly beginning to crumble, and Mark, in his own way, was beginning to see the world differently. At first, it was little things. He made sure to greet Jimmy when they crossed paths, though there was still a slight unease in his voice. He offered to help a neighbor with a task, something he would have never considered before. It wasn't enough to erase the years of prejudice or the mistakes he had made, but it was a beginning. He didn't apologize. Mark wasn't one for words like that, but his actions, however small, spoke louder than any apology could. Jimmy, ever patient and understanding, noticed the changes. He didn't push for explanations or demand apologies. He knew redemption wasn't something that could be rushed, nor was it something that could be forced. It was a journey, a slow, often painful process of facing the truth and choosing to change. And for Mark, this was just the first step. Still, there were moments of tension. Jimmy was cautious, still unsure of the sincerity behind Mark's gestures. Trust wasn't something that could be given freely after years of distrust and animosity. But Jimmy, having lived through his own battles with prejudice and misjudgment, understood that healing took time. He accepted Mark's small efforts, knowing that it was a long road ahead. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a path, one that people had to choose to walk on their own terms. And so, life moved forward. The community, now united by the events that had unfolded, began to heal as well. The cracks in the facade of their once divided neighborhood were slowly being filled. People who had once been wary of Jimmy, people who had whispered behind his back, were now speaking up in his defense. The false narratives were being replaced with truth, and the walls of prejudice that had once separated them were starting to crumble. One evening, a letter arrived at Jimmy's door. It was an invitation to a gathering, a community event to honor his bravery. At first, Jimmy hesitated. He had never sought recognition or fame. He had done what he felt was right, without expecting anything in return. But Lisa, who had been by his side through it all, encouraged him to attend. "This isn't about the attention, Jimmy," she said. "It's about the truth. It's about showing everyone that doing the right thing matters." The night of the gathering arrived, and the community center was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, old friends, and even those who had once avoided Jimmy. The air was thick with emotion, a mixture of gratitude and newfound respect. As Jimmy stood at the front of the room, he felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't the kind of recognition he had imagined. There were no grand speeches, no accolades or awards. Instead, it was a simple gathering of people who had come together to acknowledge the truth, to honor the heroism that had been buried under layers of prejudice and misunderstanding. The mayor stood up first, her voice steady as she spoke. "Tonight, we gather not just to recognize bravery, but to recognize the importance of community, of standing up for what is right, even when it's hard. And Jimmy Carter, you have shown us all what that means. Your actions that night saved lives. But perhaps more importantly, your actions have reminded us of the power of truth, redemption, and the strength of community. For that, we thank you." The room fell silent as Jimmy took the stage. He looked out over the crowd, seeing faces that had once regarded him with suspicion, now filled with respect. There were no grand words to say, no speeches to deliver. Jimmy simply nodded, his heart full of gratitude. This wasn't about him. It was about the people who had stood by him, the people who had seen the truth. As the applause rang out, Lisa and Ethan stood by his side, their smiles radiant. This was a resolution, the emotional climax of everything Jimmy had fought for. Not the applause, not the recognition, but the knowledge that the truth had prevailed, that the community had come together, and that they were all better for it. Mark, standing at the back of the room, felt a quiet sense of remorse. He wasn't there to receive any accolades. He had a long way to go before he could fully make amends. But seeing Jimmy, seeing the way the community had come together, filled him with a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't out of reach. As the night drew to a close, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the sense of unity lingered in the air. Jimmy knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, still prejudices to overcome. But for the first time, he felt hopeful. The community had come together, not just to honor him, but to honor the power of truth, change, and second chances. And that, for Jimmy, was enough. The resolution wasn't in the applause. It was in the hearts of those who had learned to see each other as people, not as stereotypes. It was in the knowledge that the battle for justice and understanding had begun, and that change was possible one step at a time. In the weeks that followed the town hall and the formal recognition of Jimmy's bravery, the community began to heal in ways they had never anticipated. The division that once existed between the people was slowly replaced by understanding, and the prejudices that had once run deep were now openly challenged. It was as if the events that had unfolded had served as a wake-up call, a moment for everyone to re-examine their assumptions and their biases. The lesson that the town learned was simple but profound. Justice and kindness could and should coexist. Prejudice had no place in their lives anymore, not after the truth had been revealed. The walls that had separated them, built on years of misunderstanding and judgment, started to crumble, and in their place, bridges began to form. People who had once turned their backs on Jimmy, whispering about him behind closed doors, now spoke up in his defense. They realized that he wasn't just a black veteran. He was a man who had been wronged, but who had also done the right thing when faced with danger. It wasn't just the big moments that had changed everything. It was the small, everyday shifts, the ways people began to treat one another differently. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged pleasantries. People who had stayed silent during moments of injustice found their voices. It was a subtle but powerful transformation, one that was felt in every corner of the town. Lisa and Ethan's bond with Jimmy deepened over time. In the weeks after the gathering, they spent more time together. Lisa, once wary of Jimmy because of the biases she had inherited from the community, now saw him for who he truly was, a man of integrity, a man of kindness. She would often bring Ethan over to visit, and they would sit on Jimmy's porch, talking about life, the neighborhood, and the lessons they had all learned through the ordeal. For Ethan, Jimmy became more than just a neighbor. He became a mentor. The young boy, who had been terrified that night of the burglary, now looked up to Jimmy with awe and admiration. He had witnessed firsthand the kind of bravery that didn't seek glory or recognition. Jimmy had acted because it was the right thing to do, and that simple truth left a lasting impression on Ethan. He began to model his actions after Jimmy's example, standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Jimmy's lessons went beyond survival. They were about honor, compassion, and the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. As the days passed, Jimmy found himself reflecting more and more on his life. He had faced prejudice in many forms. During his time in the military, in his civilian life, and now in his own neighborhood. But through it all, he had never given up on doing the right thing. He had seen injustice, felt its sting, but had always chosen to stand tall, to face it with resolve. And that had made all the difference. In his quiet moments, Jimmy would sit alone in his garden, his hands resting on the cool earth, and think about everything that had happened. He had spent his life trying to live with integrity, to be someone who could make a difference, even in small ways. And now, in the twilight of his years, he realized that he had done just that. By simply standing firm in the truth, by doing the right thing when it mattered most, he had changed his community. He had reminded them that kindness and justice were not just ideals, but actions that could shape the world around them. The lesson was clear, not just to Jimmy, but to everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. Standing up for the truth, even when it seems impossible, always matters. In a world where it's easy to remain silent, to turn away from injustice, the courage to do the right thing makes an indelible impact. And though Jimmy's actions may not have been celebrated in the way he had once imagined, the quiet ripple effect of his bravery had reached far beyond what anyone could have expected. As the months went by, the town found itself changed. Mark, though he still had a long way to go, began to open up to others, slowly realizing that his old ways no longer had a place in this new world. And Jimmy, ever humble, continued to live his life with the same quiet dignity he always had, knowing that even in the face of adversity, he had stood his ground and made a difference. The town had learned something that could never be forgotten. Kindness was a force for change, prejudice had no place in their hearts, and justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The lesson would live on in the actions of those who had witnessed it, passed down to future generations like a legacy of hope, compassion, and the belief that even the smallest act of courage could change the world. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the suburban neighborhood. The quiet hum of the evening settled over the street as Jimmy Carter knelt down in his small vegetable garden, his hands working the soil with a calm, practiced rhythm. It was a peaceful, familiar act, one that had always brought him a sense of solace, a connection to the earth that grounded him through the ups and downs of life. The garden had been his sanctuary for years, a place where he could reflect, think, and simply be. As he gently tended to the plants, adjusting the leaves and pulling out the occasional weed, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Lisa and Ethan walking toward him, their faces bright with smiles. Ethan was carrying a small bag of fresh cookies, a treat he'd made with Lisa earlier that day. It had become a routine now, visiting Jimmy on the weekends, spending time together as a family. Over the months, their bond had deepened, rooted in gratitude and respect for the man who had saved them and changed their lives. "Hey, Jimmy," Ethan called out, his voice full of warmth and excitement. Jimmy smiled as he stood up, wiping his hands on his worn gardening gloves. "Well, look at that. You bring me cookies, he said, his voice light with affection. Lisa grinned, handing over the bag. "Fresh out of the oven," she said, her eyes shining with appreciation. "Thank you again for everything." Jimmy nodded, accepting the gesture with humility. "It was the least I could do, Lisa. You've got a good boy here." Proud of him, Ethan beamed, thrilled by the compliment. "Thanks, Jimmy. I learned how to bake just like you taught me. Doing the right thing, even if it's tough." They all laughed, the sound filling the quiet air around them. The moment was simple, but it was perfect. It wasn't just about the cookies or the garden. It was about the bond that had grown between them over time, the trust, the understanding, and the deep sense of connection that had come from standing together in the face of adversity. As they chatted, Mark Henderson walked down the street, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel of the sidewalk. He had been avoiding Jimmy for weeks, unsure of how to approach him after everything that had happened. The once proud man had taken small steps toward change, but there were still moments when his pride held him back. Mark glanced toward Jimmy's garden, and for the briefest moment he hesitated, standing still as he watched the small, peaceful scene unfold before him. He saw Lisa and Ethan laughing together with Jimmy, a stark contrast to the tension and division that had once defined their interactions. Mark's eyes flicked to Jimmy, then back to the ground. He took a deep breath, his internal struggle clear. It wasn't easy, this process of change, but as he stood there, he knew something was different now. The walls that had kept him at a distance were slowly crumbling, and he found himself unable to ignore the truth any longer. Without a word, Mark took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes meeting Jimmy's with a mixture of hesitation and quiet respect. Then, in an almost imperceptible gesture, he gave Jimmy a small nod. It wasn't a grand acknowledgement. There were no words, no dramatic decorations, but it was enough. It was a silent recognition, an understanding that things had changed, that he had changed. Jimmy looked up at Mark, his expression softening. The past wasn't forgotten, nor was it erased by a single nod or a fleeting gesture. But it was a start, and that was enough. A small step toward healing, toward understanding, and toward redemption. Jimmy returned the nod, a quiet smile on his face. The two men, once divided by prejudice and mistrust, stood in a moment of mutual acknowledgement. As Mark continued on his way, his footsteps heavy but purposeful, Jimmy returned to his garden. Lisa and Ethan stayed by his side, and the conversation resumed, full of laughter and light. There was no need for grand gestures or final speeches. The change had already begun, unfolding in small, meaningful ways. The truth had come to light, and it had set the stage for redemption, not just for Jimmy, but for the entire community. As the evening faded into night, Jimmy sat back on his heels, surveying the garden that had once been his quiet refuge. The plants were thriving, growing strong and steady, much like the town itself. Change, though slow and sometimes painful, was still possible. And as Jimmy looked out at the world around him, at the neighbors who were learning to see each other as people, not stereotypes, and the friends who had become like family, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long, but it was worth it. The community was healing, one small step at a time. And Jimmy knew that no matter how long the road was, they were all walking it together. The end